Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, welcome in. If you're coming back, I'm so glad to have you. Today I want to talk a little bit about my experience with death and dying and terminal illness in another country. I have talked about my husband being Turkish before, so let's talk about the differences between USA and Turkey when it comes to terminal illness and death and dying. So in USA, I am a hospice nurse and I advocate heavily for symptom management and for a hospice for people who are at end of life, terminally ill. So we had planned a trip to Turkey to see our family, and just before we went, my father-in-law was found to be terminally ill and actually transitioned really quickly. He did pass during the 2 weeks that we were there, and this is my experience with palliative care. In Turkey, they don't truly have a hospice program like we do in the USA, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just different. And he did not have morphine, lorazepam, and the usual medications that I'm used to seeing in the USA at end of life. And so that was a stark contrast to hear my husband's account of his bedside. My husband was at his bedside at the end of life and did recount that my father-in-law was very restless and talkative and pretty uncomfortable. He was not comfortable like we see in the USA. So I want to preface this by saying that I'm not negatively speaking, just sharing the differences and the experience. In USA, when we bring somebody on hospice and they have a terminal diagnosis and their life expectancy is 6 months or less, we bring on a comfort kit when we come into the home as hospice nurses. Turkey does offer palliative type services, but it is a whole different scenario. Now, in hospice, you have the support of the nurse, the CNA, the chaplain, the social worker. All those people are coming into the home and they will support you daily with those cares. Whereas in Turkey, they do offer like a palliative type situation in the hospital. They offer home health type situations where they can come to the home, and they do have nurses that will come to the home and provide services for your family member, but ultimately the family is responsible for the care that the patient receives in a palliative setting in Turkey. Whereas in USA, in hospice, if a patient would be in a facility like a hospital or a nursing home or a hospice facility, the nurse and the CNA would provide those cares at the bedside so that the family could kind of have a break, right? The family would not be responsible to provide those cares. Now, what I did like in Turkey is that they did provide, they did provide a doctor and a nurse to give medications like IV fluids for comfort, and unfortunately they did put an NG tube down, which I don't think he liked very much. And in my husband's recounting of the situation, my father-in-law just wasn't well managed with his symptoms, and so I feel like it was much more traumatic than it needed to be. However, it truly is a different culture and a different experience, and I think it was a good learning experience for me and helped me to appreciate what I am part of as a hospice nurse in providing that kind of care to people. And I sure wish I could have provided that kind of care to my father-in-law at the end of his life. He was always very kind to me, and I sure hated to see him not be comfortable and not well managed. What I did like is that my husband was able to call a nurse to come out and put a Foley in at the bedside, but it can be very exhausting for family members to give 24/7 care. And like I said, in that setting, the family truly is responsible for finding caregivers at end of life with no relief if they don't have the finances to do so. So I know that there are programs, but they are government driven and it can be a long wait for those types of programs. It's not that there's nothing available for those families, it's that the process is very different than the process we have, where we can bring somebody on hospice. The second they get a referral, we can turn around and admit them onto hospice the same day. If we deem that they are appropriate for services, we can go out, admit them on services, and get them comfortable and get their medications to them in an urgent situation where they can be symptom managed. I want to say pain managed, but symptom managed at end of life. The whole experience was just very different and educational for me, as well as emotional, but we won't talk about that piece of things today. I think it's really important to understand when you're taking care of people from another country or another culture, what their beliefs may be surrounding death and dying and symptom management. I've talked about this before, but I think I experienced it firsthand by seeing how my husband's family and my husband handled his father's death. And I think, again, I'm very grateful to work for a service that provides the hospital bed in the home, gets equipment in the home. We get a nurse and a CNA, and we have access to a doctor in the home. And I think that that would have been very helpful to the family for him to have had a hospital bed in the home. And if I could go back and change one thing, it would be that he had those medications and that comfort, and that his family had that type of support. They did have a doctor and nurse, like I said. They were in a palliative room, and I think that's pretty special. We don't have that in USA, you know, you can't. So families are responsible in the USA to provide care to their loved ones, and it can become a financial burden for them as well. And you do have to have the finances to pay for a caregiver in USA too, although I think those resources are sometimes available when you're lower income to find like a personal caregiver for a certain amount of time. There are programs that will help you if you don't have the finances to do that. But facility wise, you can't just go into a facility in hospice in America, because you have to have a symptom or a need, right? You have to have a need that requires a higher level of care. So for most things, death in and of itself and actively dying, as I've said, is not an unmanaged symptom. Whereas unmanaged pain, unmanaged restlessness, anxiety, those sorts of things that you can't get under control in the home would then qualify a patient to go into an inpatient type setting. Whereas in Turkey, you can take your family, your loved one to a hospital room and out of the home, which some people don't want to be out of the home, but then some people get a little extra boost of care by being in that room and having that room available. It kind of takes them out of the home. Some people are not comfortable with death in the home. You know, some families don't want their loved one to pass at home. They want them to pass in a facility. And again, that comes back to the type of death that you feel is a good death for you. When you're on hospice, it is based on your comfort and what your wishes are, right? We want to give people dignity, compassion, and a peaceful death. And I think that could have been possible if the symptom management would have been good. But again, you are responsible for finding a caregiver, and finding a caregiver is possible. My husband had to do a lot of searching, and he was able to find a caregiver. Unfortunately, by the time the caregiver was able to arrive, his father had passed. So my husband was able to spend time at the bedside for the last 2 days of his father's life and provide care for his father. And I think that can be very challenging if you don't have a medical background and you've never had to provide that kind of care. So I do love what we do in hospice. I'm grateful for the nurses and CNAs that we work with that help families to learn how to provide that care and do it in a way that's not painful for the patient and not painful for the family member, because, you know, it's really difficult to turn and reposition people and wash them and provide those cares. So what are your experiences surrounding death? Have you ever experienced death in another country? What kind of things did you notice about end-of-life care? Did they have comfort meds? Did they have a hospice or palliative program? Do they have visiting nurses? I would love to have this kind of conversation in the chat, because I think that it's an interesting and valuable conversation to have, and it helps us in the health community to have an understanding of where our patients might be at, and thinking of religious backgrounds, cultural differences. All of those things really are key into what we do as healthcare workers in providing the proper care. So I ask that if you like what you see here, that you like, subscribe, and follow for more. And please, please leave a comment. I do read your comments. I've been away for a while, but I'm back. So I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.